Going into week 17, oh, going into Monday Night Football, Trevor Lawrence is the quarterback 10 on the week for week 16, and he faced off against the New York Jets on Thursday Night Football. Lawrence finished 20 of 31 passing, 229 passing yards. He did not have a pick or an interception, but he set a secondary season high for rushing yards. He had 51. Only one other game this year did he eclipse that with 53 back in week 9 against Las Vegas. But for the second time in 3 games, Lawrence rushed for a touchdown, which got him to 18.2 fantasy points for the week. And this is the 5th time in the last 6 games that Trevor Lawrence has been a top 10 quarterback. And he gets Houston in week 17. And Houston is tough against opposing quarterbacks. Teams don't score a lot of fantasy points through the air against the Houston Texans because there are a lot of fantasy points scored on the ground. And Houston has nothing to lose. Houston ended up actually winning their game in week 16. So they're playing with a little bit of extra oomph, and the Jaguars, the game really that only matters to them is week 18. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Jaguars, even though they're on a hot streak, even though they're playing really well, they may pull starters later on in the game if the game is in hand, or they may not be as aggressive. Now, maybe they are going to be a little aggressive at the beginning of the game. You could see Lawrence being aggressive down the field with Zay Jones and Marvin Jones and Christian Kirk. But I would not anticipate a full game of aggression for Trevor Lawrence against the Houston Texans, especially given that the Houston Texans are really susceptible to giving up fantasy points on the ground. In fact, the Houston Texans give up the most fantasy points to running backs. So I view this as a big Travis Etienne game, rushing, sprinkle in a little bit of deep Jamichael Hasty. Like, you have to bump up Hasty a bit in your rankings. But Trevor Lawrence he's going to be an auto start for you against a bad Houston team, even though there's not a lot of upside. There are narratives to think that he's not going to be a top 5 quarterback like he had been in 3 of the previous 4 games going into week 16. So I think quarterback 10, quarterback 12 is going to be the right spot for him. Maybe you could bump him up to quarterback 8, but I'm not getting him into that top 5 ranking for this final week unless we hear other news that there are going to be other starters that are resting week 17. I just don't anticipate that being the case. So Trevor Lawrence he's still a startable quarterback for me against Houston, even though Houston hasn't given up a lot of fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. But you do have to temper expectations. You shouldn't expect a week 14 game like Kansas City where he was the quarterback 1, scored 33 points. That's just not how I envision that week going for him. Running back Travis Etienne finished week 16 as the running back 14, 12.7 fantasy points, 22 rushing attempts, 83 yards, so not very efficient on the ground. He did tie a season high with 3 receptions, had 29 receiving yards, which is the most receiving yards he's had since week 5 against Houston. And Travis Etienne, as much as we've been happy with the amount of volume, over the last 4 games, he's had at least 70% of the snaps out of the backfield, and he had 17 carries in the first half. Etienne has been disappointing through the passing game, and we haven't seen more than 30 receiving yards since that week 5 game. So against Houston, again, we look back what he did against Houston, he only played 53% of the snaps, 10 rushes, 71 yards, 3 receptions, 43 yards, finished as the running back 22 that week. He has had no receiving touchdowns on the year. So Travis Etienne, I do expect him to get more of the rushes. Back then in week 5, James Robinson was on the team. And for Etienne to finish as the running back 22, I think it's pretty secure that he's going to get into that top 12 ranking for me, given the positive matchup, given his previous history, and that the Houston Texans are very susceptible to giving up fantasy points to the running back position. They, in fact, give up the most fantasy points to opposing running backs on the year. And even though Travis Etienne has been hit or miss over the last 5 weeks or so in regards to efficiency, I still expect that he's going to have a big game and is one of those auto start running backs that you're going to be happy putting into your lineup in week 17 against the Houston Texans. If you like the content and this is helpful to you, make sure you hit that red subscribe button. It really helps the channel. Receiver Christian Kirk finished with only 4.1 fantasy points in week 16 against the Jets. And there are many reasons why we could see this playing out. It was bad weather. The Jets play good defense against opposing wide receivers, especially in the slot. Christian Kirk did not have a good wide receiver cornerback matchup for that week. And he still got 6 targets in the game, but only 3 for 22. And then he also had a rush for 4 yards. He finished at the wide receiver 61 in the week. And it has been alternating right over the last few weeks. Not like that's predictable, but at least it's an interesting pattern. Week 10, wide receiver 4. Week 12, wide receiver 63. Week 13, wide receiver 19. Then wide receiver 47, wide receiver 21, wide receiver 61. So it seems like he's bouncing back and forth between a productive week and a not productive week. And Houston, while they don't give up a lot of fantasy points to the wide receiver, if it falls under the narrative of Jacksonville wants to put the foot on the gas and wants to blow the Houston Texans out, this could be a massive game for Christian Kirk, because many of the pieces of the secondary for the Houston Texans are not graded as good cornerbacks or good players in the secondary. So I would be firing up Christian Kirk if we find out that, yes, the Jaguars are playing for something. So this is a narrative that I'm monitoring very closely, because it could very much fall the other way. This Houston game really doesn't play much consequence into whether or not the Jaguars make the playoffs. It ultimately will come down to that week 18 matchup against Tennessee. So we're paying very close attention to that Tennessee matchup in week 18, but it's not relevant for fantasy. So I feel like there is just a wide range of outcomes for Christian Kirk. Could he hit? Absolutely. He could be a top 20 wide receiver. And in fact, on the season, Christian Kirk, wide receiver 14. However, there's also a very significant narrative where he doesn't hit. So if you have safer pieces, I would suggest starting them over Christian Kirk. That's how I would view Kirk, as a very wide range type of wide receiver. And that's what he's displayed over the past 5-6 weeks of the season. So he's not someone I'm trusting that it is within the range of outcomes that he hits. He could have a 5 for 70 and a touchdown game, and then he's totally worth it. I'm cautious to offer that as the path to success for Christian Kirk. He is not going to be someone that I'm going out of my way to find or put in my lineup. Look, I get it. Zay Jones really disappointed in week 16, and that doesn't bode well, at least in a point of confidence, for week 17. Zay Jones only 4 targets in this game. That's the fewest targets he's had since week 8 against Denver, where he went 3 for 28, finishes the wide receiver 58. In this game, week 16 against the Jets, of course, the weather was bad. He had really tough matchups on the outside. Sauce Gardner played him pretty well, but all of the New York Jets cornerbacks played well against Zay Jones, and only 4 targets that Sauce Gardner gets almost never targeted. So this is a tough look, right? Wide receiver 85 is not going to, after having 31.9 fantasy points in week 15 against Dallas, 6 for 109 and 3 touchdowns. We were very hopeful, but I didn't offer that he was going to be a wide receiver 1. I offered he was a low to mid wide receiver 2, where we expected volume. And there were 4 of the last 5 games where Zay Jones had double-digit targets. Like Christian Kirk, I'm monitoring this situation closely. Could Zay Jones have a big game against a bad secondary? Absolutely. But it could also fall into the narrative of Trevor Lawrence doesn't need to throw that ball that much. He's going to hand the ball off to Travis Etienne. It's going to be a Travis Etienne rushing game with a little sprinkling of Jermichael Hasty. That's a possibility. I'm just not excited about trying to fit Zay Jones into my lineup in week 17. We've seen his ceiling. We've seen double-digit fantasy points in 4 of the last 5 games going into that Jets game. But the weather was bad, the matchup was bad, and the Jets don't give up a lot of fantasy points to opposing cornerbacks. And the similarly is the case for Houston. Those defensive backs don't give up a lot of fantasy points to opposing wide receivers, but it's not because they are good players. It's because they don't get a lot of passing volume. In fact, Houston has among the fewest pass attempts against in the league. Teams are just not willing to throw against the Houston Texans because they can run the ball. So Zay Jones, I feel as though, is an extremely risky play in week 17. Could he go 5 for 60 and then have a touchdown? Yes. Like, then it would be 14 fantasy points. You are just fine. You're happy with that. But I think that there are safer plays in this week 17, especially coming off a scary matchup or a scary result against the Jets. This game is in a dome, so you don't have to worry about weather in Houston, but you do have to worry about are the Jaguars motivated to get Zay Jones the ball 10 times? I think there is significant concern there. Yeah, Zay Jones is not someone that I'm looking to fit into my lineup. A player you have to be fitting into your lineup now is Evan Engram. Tight end Evan Engram has at least 7 targets in each of the last 4 games. He's played at least 75% of the snaps, so he is getting majority of snaps. He's getting significant amount of targets, and he's had 3 touchdowns in the last 4 games, right? Double-digit fantasy points in each of the last 4 games. And you have to be happy with the results, right? He's been a top 12 tight end each of the last 4 weeks, and he gets Houston. And Houston, they don't give a lot of fantasy points to opposing wide receivers, but they do give up a lot of fantasy points to opposing tight ends, because if you think about how the flow of drives go against Houston, right, their opposing teams like to rush the ball, and then maybe they do a play fake and then near the goal line, and then who's open but a tight end? So these tight ends tend to get open near the goal line because Houston doesn't have a great secondary. They don't have a great linebacking core. So this could yet again be an Evan Engram game. We've seen 113 receiving yards to the last 3 games from Engram. He has become a favorite target for Trevor Lawrence. This game is in a dome, so we don't have to worry about the weather. And I'm not too worried about Evan Engram not being a part of the plan. It's very clear that he is a part of the plan. And even before the last 4 games, we had seen 5 other games this year where Evan Engram had at least 6 targets. So that's 9 games during the span of 15 games where Evan Engram is getting a really significant target share for tight ends. And finally, those are coming to fruition here near the end of the season. So Evan Engram, he's going to be a starting tight end for me. I feel comfortable starting Evan Engram over Mark Andrews in this final week. That's a barometer, or the line that I'm willing to draw in the sand on Evan Engram. So this is a tight end too that is tight end 5 on the season. You're finding ways to get Evan Engram into your lineup based on what he's shown, based on the matchup, and based on his very proximate production. So you're interested in getting Evan Engram into your lineup. Quarterback Mike White is expected to play in week 17 against Seattle in Seattle. And the Seahawks give up a lot of fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. This is one of those green matchups. And yes, White is coming off of the ribs injury. So maybe he doesn't hit that like quarterback 5, quarterback 6, quarterback 7 type of ceiling. But in his 2 other green games this year, where he was the starting quarterback against Chicago, he finishes the quarterback 6, 22 of 28, 3 passing touchdowns. And then week 13 against Minnesota, 369 passing yards and a rushing score, finishes the quarterback 7. So I think Mike White is in that top 10, top 12 quarterback discussion. The way he's played this year, you have to be happy with, even against Buffalo, which is a red matchup. It's a tough matchup against quarterbacks. Still 268 passing yards. He didn't throw any interceptions in that game. Finishes the quarterback 22, but you have to remember he got hit multiple times in the ribs, and he missed the last 2 games against Detroit and Jacksonville due to those ribs injuries. But now he's had time. He's been medically cleared, and this is where you got to trust that he's going to get the ball to his guys. This year, 22 of 28 is 75+% completion percentage, and then even in that Minnesota game, 31 of 57. So there's passing volume that can exist with Mike White. This game could turn into a nice little shootout for the Seahawks and then the Jets. So I'm interested in getting Mike White as a streaming option at quarterback this week. I get it that we're a little hesitant maybe about the ribs, and based on what I've been reading and researching, there's only really the upside issue. We've seen some of those from Justin Herbert, right? So if we remember at the beginning of the year, Justin Herbert dealt with a ribs injury And we still saw, like, yes, a couple inconsistent, like quarterback 21s and quarterback 18s and 24s, but then quarterback 8 as well against Seattle, where there was a lot of passing volume against the Seahawks. So could I see 30 completions on 50 attempts for 275 to 300 yards and a couple touchdowns? Yeah, that's what I could see for Mike White. So I'm interested in seeing if he can get into that quarterback 10, quarterback 12 range. I'm more excited about starting him than like Aaron Rodgers, right? Even though it's against Minnesota, the game is in Green Bay. I don't expect this to be a high scoring game, even though Minnesota does give up a lot of fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks and wide receivers. It's just that the weather's probably going to be cold. It's going to be outside in the dome. And I'd rather take the role on a game that could turn into a massive shootout. I just don't think Green Bay has the offensive weapons to do it, whereas the New York Jets have, of course, Elijah Moore and Garrett Wilson and Corey Davis, who's healthy. That's why I'm leaning Mike White for week number 17. Running back Michael Carter, he had 7 touches in this game, finished with 7.5 fantasy points against the Jacksonville Jaguars. Running back 32 on the week, 2 for 6 on the ground, so not a lot going, but 5 receptions for 44 yards through the air. And I think this is about the space where Michael Carter is going to be. And this is what I thought as well, is that Jacksonville does give up a lot of fantasy points to opposing running backs, but I didn't think that Michael Carter's role was going to massively boom. And so we haven't seen double-digit carries from Michael Carter since week 9 against Buffalo, where he finishes the running back 9. And look, he gets Seattle, so this is also a green matchup against running backs. I still think that he's like a mid-pack running back 3 for you, like a desperation flex play. You're hoping he falls in the end zone for him to pay off, but that's what Michael Carter is right now. It was nice to see him get involved in the passing game. This is the 5th time that Michael Carter has at least 5 targets in a game, and the second time in the last 3 games. I think Michael Carter is, an interesting back, and maybe given how Zonovan Knight has performed over the last couple weeks, I think he might be the preferred option in this Jets backfield, but that's really not saying much because Zonovan Knight hasn't done much lately. So Michael Carter, 50 total yards on 7 touches. It's not terrible, but you're hoping that in a plus matchup against Seattle, he'll fall into the end zone. He's not a player that I'm going out of my way to put into my fantasy lineup for week 17. Talk about fantasy disappointment the last 2 weeks. Zonovan Knight has finished as the running back 58 and the running back 66 on 19 carries for 21 yards rushing, no touchdowns, and he has 1 target and 1 reception for 15 yards. So this may be a plus matchup. Like, could Zonovan Knight fall the right way against really plus Seattle front 7? Yes, I think that this could be a game where Zonovan Knight gets back to his 13 to 14 or 15 carries. I think that's a possibility because this game could very much turn into a shootout, and I'm interested in pieces of this game. But the last couple weeks, especially against Jacksonville, it was concerning to me that it was Ty Johnson and it was Michael Carter who were getting rotated in instead of Zonovan Knight. So I think that Zonovan Knight, he was already on a short leash. I think that leash has gotten even shorter, like only in the most desperate of leagues, like 16-team, 32-team leagues, are you rolling out Zonovan Knight as a running back 2 or a flex play. You're not going out of your way to say, yeah, he's a running back 2. His trust is eroded. He has 41% of snaps in week 16. That was the lowest percentage of snaps on the season when he's played. So I'm not interested in Zonovan Knight really, and he's only a desperation running backs 3/4 in this Seattle matchup. And it's a plus matchup, so he could get the volume. It could roll the right way. It's just that level of trust is so eroded that I can't get behind a recommendation of Zonovan Knight, even though Seattle gives up a lot of fantasy points to opposing running backs. Garrett Wilson disappointed in week 16 against Jacksonville. But his wide receiver 75 finish and 3 fantasy points, they are misleading. You shouldn't be benching Garrett Wilson just because of this performance. Instead, Garrett Wilson 4 for 30 through the air. So you would have expected 5 fantasy points, but he lost a fumble in this game. He had 9 targets And this is the 5th straight game where Garrett Wilson has at least 7 targets. And now he gets Mike White back. And in the 2 games where Mike White played against Chicago and then Minnesota in those green matchups, Garrett Wilson finished as the wide receiver 2 and the wide receiver 9. And then even against the Buffalo, where it was a tough matchup, finished as wide receiver 29. So there is a lot of ceiling in this green matchup against Seattle. There's a lot of upside for Garrett Wilson, and his floor is a back-end wide receiver too. I don't know exactly where the rankings are going to fall for where the consensus is on Garrett Wilson, but I want to be at wide receiver 13 to 15 is probably the range where I'm going to plop Garrett Wilson. But if anyone has him below like wide receiver 20, they're being foolish. This is a player he's earned his pedigree in a sense. Like he's proven that he would deserve to be the 10th overall pick. He's crushed it this year. He's earned a tremendous amount of targets. We've seen elite upside. There have been 3 different games where he's finished as a top 9 wide receiver on the season, and he just continues to command targets. And if he gets consistency at that quarterback position next year, we're talking about not just a top 10 dynasty or top 5 dynasty wide receiver, but a top 10 wide receiver just for next year. And he may have already earned that. We will see where the ADPs land, but I want to be aggressive about getting Garrett Wilson onto my fantasy teams in 2023. But for this matchup against Seattle, yes, on paper, the secondary is tough against opposing wide receivers, but I'm not concerned about Mike White getting the ball to Garrett Wilson for big gains and a lot of fantasy points. This game could very much turn into shootout, and Garrett Wilson could be at the center of that. Wide receiver Elijah Moore finished with 2 receptions for 15 yards on 3 targets. But what was encouraging for Elijah Moore is he once again got above that 70% snap share threshold. And this was the 3rd straight game where he's done so. 81% of snaps, even though he finished as wide receiver 78 on the week. And I love Elijah Moore's talent. I've been touting him. He was the 34th overall pick back in 2021 out of Ole Miss. I'm just a big fan of Elijah Moore and his talent level. And I think in the Chicago game, he finished as the wide receiver 23. And in the Minnesota game, he had 6 targets. And then in the Buffalo game, 6 for 60 on 10 targets. So Mike White is willing to target Elijah Moore more than Zach Wilson was. And then we had Chris Streveler trying to throw the ball and run the ball. It just was not going to work in the bad weather. Elijah Moore, I think this is a bounce back game. I don't think he gets into that wide receiver 2 range or anything like that, or even gets into necessarily wide receiver 3 range. But in your deeper leagues, he's a flex consideration. If this game turns into a shootout, Elijah Moore could be one of those options that falls into the end zone. So Elijah Moore is not, once again, someone I'm trying to fit into my lineup, but it wouldn't surprise me if he had a big game against the Seattle Seahawks. Wide receiver Corey Davis has been an interesting case this year, right? We've seen him over the last couple games when he's played at least 70% of the snaps over the last 4 games that he's played. Right, he has 10 and 7 targets in those games. But in this most recent game against Jacksonville, he played 97% of snaps, commanded 7 targets, only 14 receiving yards for 2 receptions. Probably due to Zach Wilson being the PFF's worst graded passer among qualified quarterbacks, and then also Chris Streveler not being able to throw the ball in bad weather. Now enter Seattle, where, of course, like the weather could play a factor in this outside wide receivers game, but I also anticipate that he's going to be heavily involved. If you look at what Corey Davis did in his game against Chicago, right? 68% of snaps coming off of the injury, 1 catch for 9 yards, 3 targets, fine. But in the Minnesota game, where he had gotten full game action previously, 5 receptions, 85 yards on 10 targets. Now, Seattle secondary is not as generous as Minnesota's, but I still expect 6 to 8 targets for Corey Davis on the outside. Once again, this is a shootout possibility, so I'm interested in getting Corey Davis as a deep league consideration. Not someone that I'm ranking as a top 36 wide receiver, but he has upside to get into that top 24, top 30 wide receiver. So if you're hoping for someone to hit, Corey Davis has the talent, and he most likely has the opportunity against a Seattle defense that the Jets are hoping to take advantage of in Seattle. Tight end Tyler Conklin has had his ups and downs this year, right? We saw in week 8 against New England, he went 6 for 79 and had 2 touchdowns in that game, finishes the tight end 1, then went on a cold streak, tight end 41 and 31, and then 3 for 50, finishes the tight end 17 against Chicago in week 12. And then the revenge game narrative did not go as planned against Minnesota, tight end 41, but then in Buffalo, 5 for 28 on 8 targets in week 14. Detroit, he really didn't do much. And then Jacksonville, 4 for 34, finishes the tight end 22, 71% of snaps. He will be out there. And he's just not a player that I'm confidently rolling out. Tyler Conklin is the tight end 16 on the year with not a lot of touchdown upside. There are only 2 games out of 15 where he finished with a touchdown. So he doesn't have touchdown upside. There are other offensive players who get touches pretty regularly in this offense. Corey Davis, Elijah Moore, Garrett Wilson, Michael Carter, of course, Zonovan Knight. So there are players that are getting prioritized over Tyler Conklin. At least it's been interesting. 3 of the last 4 games, he's had at least 4 targets, but still not a highly graded tight end over the last few weeks. And his receiving upside, he has 1 game since week 9 with at least 50 receiving yards, and most of those games are 34 receiving yards or below. So I'm not interested in shoving Tyler Conklin into my lineup. He's a low upside, medium floor type of tight end. Just not a player that I'm interested in week 17 in the championship week. The highest graded rushing quarterback in rushing grade from weeks 12 to 15, it's Tyler Allgeier. Funny enough, that's PFF grades, and he did not disappoint. Allgeier did not disappoint in week 16 against Baltimore. He was a player that I thought was going to get volume, and he did get volume, even though it wasn't as efficient as he did against New Orleans in week 15. But Allgeier, 18 for 74 on the ground. He set a career high in receptions and targets, 4 receptions, 5 targets, 43 receiving yards. And this is a player, he finished as the running back 11 this week, 59% of the snaps. This is only the 3rd time where he's gone at least 59% of the snaps, 13.7 fantasy points against Baltimore. And that's a tough defense to finish as the running back 11 and not fall in the end zone. That's a testament to Allgeier, who's put together 2 straight games with over 100 total yards against Arizona, who just gave up a poop ton of fantasy points against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers backfield. Rachaad White had the touchdown. Leonard Fournette had over 100 total yards. So Tyler Allgeier is a player that I think you can confidently plug in as a running back 2. It's a positive matchup. He's been crushing as of late. His efficiency has been there, and the Falcons are playing for fun right now. They're 5-10 right now, and they face Arizona, who we don't know if Colt McCoy is going to be back. It might be Trace McSorley, so we'll see. But nevertheless, Tyler Allgeier, it's extremely encouraging to see Allgeier out carry Cordarrelle Patterson significantly, and then out target Cordarrelle Patterson too. I think this is the Tyler Allgeier takeover that we've been seeing over the last couple games, and we need to be firing up Allgeier as a volume running back too, with a little bit of efficiency and a good matchup. So yes, you should be in on Tyler Allgeier in week 17. He should be one of those confident plays as a running back too. Yeah, I could see a lot going, and especially given that Arizona just lost their Pro Bowl safety, Budda Baker. So you should be confident in starting Tyler Allgeier week 17 in your championship week. He's going to get the volume. He's going to have efficiency. It's a good matchup. Fire him up. Atlanta's playing him a lot more. You should be playing him in your championship. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. Cordarrelle Patterson, right? Just when we thought he was getting back on the right track, weeks 12 and 13, Patterson didn't get double-digit fantasy points, even though he had double-digit carries. Finally, week 15 against New Orleans, 14 carries for 52 yards. He had the touchdown, 11.7 fantasy points. But in week 16, Baltimore was able to just bottle up Cordarrelle Patterson, 8 rushes, 17 yards. He had 1 catch for 14 yards, no touchdown, finishes the running back 50, only 37% of snaps. Allgeier nearly doubled the snap percentage of Cordarrelle Patterson in this game. Yes, it is a plus matchup against Arizona. So if you're like putting on a blindfold, throwing a dart, Cordarrelle Patterson, I guess, is an upside-ish play, but we really haven't seen a big game from Cordarrelle Patterson since week 9 against the Chargers, where he finishes the running back 7, 13 for 44 on the ground. Still not efficient, but 2 touchdowns in that game. And it's discouraging that Cordarrelle Patterson has more than 3 targets in just 2 games this year. Just 2 games. You're finding reasons to not play Cordarrelle Patterson. And in fact, Avery Williams got 5 touches in this game. So there's a third back getting some of Cordarrelle Patterson's touches. I'm not in on Cordarrelle Patterson for your championship game. You should be looking elsewhere. It's a positive matchup. So could he fall in the end zone on his drive if they're alternating drives? Possibly. But if I'm betting on a running back in this Atlanta backfield, the most of the bets are going to go toward Tyler Allgeier. He's proven efficiency. He's gotten better as the year's gone on. It's clear that Atlanta trusts him with more touches and now with also more targets too. So I'm going with Tyler Allgeier significantly over Cordarrelle Patterson in any sort of ranking moving forward. Look, not everything has been pretty for Drake London this rookie year, but if you can buy him low in Dynasty, the Falcons are poised to have yet another early draft pick. If they can get paired up, if Drake London can get paired up with an elite quarterback, I'm not worried about his performance this year. I'm also not worried about Kyle Pitts coming back. This was the 3rd time in the last 6 games where Drake London has finished as the wide receiver 28 or better. So fine, we've seen a little bit of a ceiling for Drake London, and it's a back-end wide receiver too. His floor, though, is a back-end wide receiver 4. And that's what we've seen mostly wide receiver 47, wide receiver 41 in the couple games where he didn't get into that back-end wide receiver 2 Rangers. But what's encouraging is over the last 3 games, Tyler Allgeier, 12, 11, and 9 targets. And he's getting a significant target share, more than what Marcus Mariota was willing to give him. Desmond Ridder, you have to give Ridder credit. Ridder more than doubled his passing yards from week 15 to week 16. Baltimore secondary was a little more generous, but still Drake London, 7 for 96. No touchdowns, but it's going to be hard to come by touchdowns when you're not scoring a lot anyways. You're not moving the ball like super effectively, but at least Tyler Allgeier is a nice piece in this offense as well. That's been a nice addition. Arizona, they lose Budda Baker for week 17. This becomes at least a possible upside matchup. I still can't, in all that I'm searching for, rank Drake London as a top 24 wide receiver going into this week. But I think that that's within the range of outcomes. I would probably put it at a wide receiver 30 if I'm putting a higher or lower line on Drake London for this week against Arizona. In the way I see that Drake London is going forward, he's getting a lot of targets, but they're not as super valuable as you would have liked to hope for. It's nice that he's getting the targets and target share. I think he's going to be a nice buy low candidate before the NFL draft. If you're doing any early best ball drafts, Drake London should be on your radar as a player that you should be taking advantage of any value that you can seep from. Quarterback Tyler Huntley finished the week 16 game against Atlanta as the quarterback 19 on the week. 0.2 fantasy points. He only had 17 attempts. And this is what I was concerned about. I was concerned that the shoulder injury would limit Tyler Huntley in his passing. And that was the case. 9 for 115. He did have a passing touchdown to Demarcus Robinson in this game, 11 for 26 on the ground. So it wasn't super efficient yet again. You're disappointed if you hoped that Tyler Huntley would be able to get you into that. Get me one spike week, please. He just hasn't delivered due to the injury, due to the lack of wide receiver core. We're counting 4 total targets for the wide receivers in this. Mark Andrews had 5 targets in this game. Josh Oliver had 3. Isaiah Likely had 2. The tight ends had 10 targets in this game. The wide receivers had 4. The leading target getter among wide receivers for the Baltimore Ravens, Deshaun Jackson, 36-year-old Deshaun Jackson. So no, there's no optimism for the passing game for Tyler Huntley. And if his rushing game isn't there, the injury is there. Yes, Baltimore gets Pittsburgh in week 17. But if we look at what Tyler Huntley did in the 2/3 of the game or so that he played against Pittsburgh, he only threw the ball 12 times. So he was projected for not even to get to 18 pass attempts or so. That's discouraging. 8 for 88 passing, 9 for 31 rushing. So maybe if you want to sprinkle in a little bit of the rushing, maybe you could get him up to 40 rushing yards. He's still at best a quarterback 24-ish is how I would put him and rank him moving forward. I don't have a lot of optimism or upside, even throwing to the likes of Mark Andrews. Andrews only went 3 for 45 on 5 targets this game. The other tight ends didn't catch much either. So Baltimore 10-5 going into week 17. And there's not a lot to play for. Baltimore has already clinched the playoffs. So it's more so about just taking care of your players and playing for pride and getting some valuable reps in as well, and making sure that Lamar Jackson is getting healthy. I would be very surprised if we see Lamar Jackson play in week 17 or week 18. I would expect that Lamar Jackson would play in the playoffs, given that Tyler Huntley is just holding down the fort as we're moving forward, trusting the Baltimore Ravens defense. Tyler Huntley is not a fantasy option that I'm looking to start in week 17, even in Superflex leagues. Running back Gus Edwards went 11 for 99 on the ground against the Atlanta Falcons. He played 40% of snaps. He finishes the running back 25. And we've seen this from Gus Edwards, right? He's a 0 in the passing game, literally no receiving yards, no receptions. He has 2 targets on the season, but it's the double-digit carry games that are going to get Gus Edwards into that like running back 25 to 30 range. And if he falls in the end zone, maybe into that running back 15 to 20 range, right? Gus Edwards is not he's got a very low upside. Running back 20 is about his ceiling with a touchdown. He was able to get to be the running back 8 in week 7 against Cleveland when JK Dobbins wasn't there, and he fell in the end zone twice. But JK Dobbins is getting carries, and Dobbins out-carried Gus Edwards in this game. But Gus Edwards is not a player that I'm going out of my way to starting unless I'm in a deeper league, and then he's got capped upside. You're getting like between 5 and 8 fantasy points pretty much from Gus Edwards every game. JK Dobbins finishes the running back 36 this week, 42% of snaps, 5.9 fantasy points, 12 for 59 on the ground. Once again, almost 5 yards a carry. That's not bad. He didn't get 120 or 125 rushing yards like he did the previous 2 games. He didn't fall in the end zone like he did in week 14 against Pittsburgh. He's also a 0 in the passing game, right? Since coming back the last 3 games, he has 2 total targets and 1 reception. So just Gus Edwards, right? I think that there's more efficiency for JK Dobbins. I think that he's the better running back. If I'm trusting someone between Dobbins and Gus Edwards, it's more likely going to be Dobbins, in my opinion. But because Dobbins is going to get more of the rushes, that's what we've seen the last 3 weeks. It's just a matter of what's Dobbins going to do. In week 17, Dobbins went 15 for 120 and had a rushing touchdown against the Pittsburgh Steelers. He had 1 big breakaway run for about 50, 60 yards. So take that away, and he still has a pretty decent game. But you're looking to get some upside fantasy points against Pittsburgh and to knock Pittsburgh out of any playoff possibility contention. That's what you're looking for from Baltimore is these interdivisional games are always a nice rivalry. And Dobbins, though, I mentioned Gus Edwards, his ceiling is like running back 24. I think Dobbins' ceiling is a little bit higher. Like running back 18 is about his ceiling, unless he falls in the end zone or has a huge chunk play. And we've seen 2 of the last 3 games, Dobbins finishes the running back 18 or better. But we saw a floor game here where Dobbins 12 for about 60 yards is his floor. And so that's how I would anticipate between running back 36 and running back 18 is the range of outcomes for for a player like JK Dobbins. Yeah, he probably ends up as a back end running back 2 for you. There may be other more upside options. Like I would start Tyler Allgeier over JK Dobbins in week 17. That's because I'm trusting Allgeier's volume. I'm trusting Allgeier's efficiency, and I'm trusting that the Falcons are willing to give more to this player through not only the ground, but also the passing game. JK Dobbins is one of those players that is a little bit better than the counterpart that he's splitting carries with, but not so significantly that he's going to get 18 to 20 carries a game. He's going to get that third down role. It's just not there for him. In fact, there is really no third down role in this Baltimore Ravens offense among running back. Yeah, if they're doing anything on third down, they're either passing to one of the wide receivers or tight ends, or Huntley is going to rush the ball, because Huntley had 11 carries in this game. Look, do we need to talk about Demarcus Robinson? I feel like we need to talk about Demarcus Robinson. He was the only wide receiver to have the touchdown catch. He was second among wide receivers in targets with 1, right? He had a 1 catch for 6 yards in that touchdown, finishes the wide receiver 43. And Demarcus Robinson has finished as the wide receiver, outside wide receiver 36 every game since week 9, except for his week 11 game against Carolina, where he went 9 for 128. Other than that, it's been pretty disappointing, even though coming into this week 16 game, 4 of his last 5 games, he had 6 targets. It's just that with Tyler Huntley throwing the ball and with the injuries and in an interdivisional game in Baltimore, Maryland, I just don't anticipate Demarcus Robinson being a fantasy contributor. Even against Pittsburgh, he last time 7.7 fantasy points, finishes the wide receiver 41. But now Huntley's still dealing with that shoulder injury, and I'm not confident that the Baltimore Ravens are going to be able to do much. I anticipate that this Ravens game is going to be under a 40 point total. Demarcus Robinson, as much as you might like to take him as a late dart throw, I'm not putting him into my lineup unless it's an extremely deep league. There's not a lot of upside there. And you're once again putting your hand over your face and throwing a dart if you're choosing a Demarcus Robinson type of player. Talk about disappointing. Mark Andrews has been the tight end 18 or worse each of the last 3 weeks. He finished with 6 fantasy points against Atlanta, 3 for 45 through the air, 9 yards per target, 15 yards per reception. And you haven't seen double-digit fantasy points from Mark Andrews since week 6 when Lamar Jackson was the quarterback. And yes, like coming into this game, Mark Andrews had 5 straight games with at least 6 targets, but he got 5 targets in this game. And it's the targets that he's getting, but they're less valuable. And Andrews hasn't scored a touchdown since week 6. So you're probably not getting a touchdown. You're getting less valuable targets from a quarterback who doesn't throw the ball a lot and who likes to run the ball and take passes out of the offense. It's just not a formula for success for Mark Andrews. I'm not in on Mark Andrews this week against Pittsburgh. Last time he went 2 for 17 against the Steelers on 6 targets. Look, I started Taysom Hill over Mark Andrews, and you're finding other tight ends to start over Andrews. It's gotten really, really ugly. Like Dawson Knox, you're starting over Mark Andrews, as bad as it sounds. There's just so much distrust with this Ravens offense and being able to get the ball to their tight ends. And could Mark Andrews fall in the end zone? Sure, that's what any tight end could do. But I think he's fallen into he's going to do what every other tight end is going to do, because it's such a downgrade in this Ravens offense that Andrews has been. We've seen his floor, and it's a scary one for what you invested draft capital in. You drafted him at the back end of the 2nd round, beginning of the 3rd round in most drafts, and you're lucky if he's carried you on into this championship final. Mark Andrews, unfortunately, could be considered a league loser for your fantasy playoff team. So yeah, I'm not in on Mark Andrews for this week against Pittsburgh either. Just a lot not going for him. And maybe you'll have to look elsewhere to find a tight end. So make sure you put in the comments of this video what tight ends you want compared to Mark Andrews, and I'll let you know rankings wise as we get closer to this Pittsburgh game against the Baltimore Ravens. Boy, oh boy, Jared Goff is the quarterback 9 on the season, and he's coming off the quarterback 2 performance against the Carolina Panthers, who were a plus matchup against quarterbacks. Goff finished 25 of 42, 355 passing yards. He had 3 passing touchdowns, 3 rush attempts for 15 yards. And as I said, the quarterback 2, and he's finished as the quarterback 4 or better in 3 of the last 4 games. He had a tough matchup against the Jets. He finishes quarterback 17, week 15, but in week 17 against Chicago, you're firing up Jared Goff at home. The home road splits are just so stark for Jared Goff. He's averaging about 275 passing yards per game at home, and he's averaging, coming into this week 16 game, only about 225 passing yards per game. And he's just been crushing at home. The last 3 games at home, Jared Goff, 17.6, 21.6, 26.1 fantasy points at home over the last 3 games. And then he gets Chicago, who has arguably one of the worst defenses in the NFL against pass and against the run. The Lions are playing for their playoff lives the last 2 games against Chicago and Green Bay. Jared Goff and the Lions have a lot to play for in week 17 and week 18. They're going to be putting the foot on the gas. This is one of those deep shots on Jamaal Williams games. Even though Jamaal Williams hasn't been playing more than 20% of snaps over the last few weeks, he's worth a dart throw, I think. And then like DJ Chark is an auto start in this Chicago game. The last time they played Chicago in week 10, 19 for 26, 236 passing yards, 1 passing touchdown for Jared Goff, 15 fantasy points. But remember, this game was in Chicago, but now we're at home. Jared Goff is at home. So you're firing him up week 17. You're firing up almost all of your Lions. This is a game where you have to be in on the Lions. And the only one that I'm a little concerned about is Jamaal Williams. He left this game in week 16 with an injury. Justin Jackson got a little bit more run, but it may be DeAndre Swift and Justin Jackson. Jackson is a very deep waiver priority ad that you should consider. But Jared Goff is a borderline must start in this week 17 game against Chicago. Running back DeAndre Swift was really disappointing in week 16. This was the first game that he had finished outside of the top 37 of running backs on the season. Swift, 4 for 12 on the ground, only 3 yards per carry, 1 reception for 13 yards on 5 targets. And this was the 4th time in the last 5 games where DeAndre Swift had at least 5 targets. It was just disappointing against Carolina. Swift played 56% of snaps, and that's the second most snaps that he played on the season, but could not translate into fantasy points. He's a much better matchup in week 17 against the Chicago Bears. Last time he played the Bears, he had 6 rushes, 6 rushing yards. He had a touchdown, 1 reception for 6 yards, finished as the running back 30 on only 31% of the snaps, 7.7 fantasy points and half PPR. But I think that with an increased snap share, with Jamaal Williams and expected to be limited in this game, or at least we're monitoring the Williams injury as we're moving forward, DeAndre Swift has the potential upside to get into that running back 1 or high-end running back 2 scenario, given the scoring possibility, the shootout potential in this game. And I want in on DeAndre Swift. He's one of those players that I'm going to try to find excuses to put in, especially after a bad game where a lot of people aren't going to be playing DeAndre Swift. So hopefully he's not going to be very well rostered. I hope that there are a lot of people that believe that it was a bad game and it's going to sit with him. I don't believe so. I believe DeAndre Swift is super talented, and that's been illustrated with the type of floor that he's had, but also a couple of ceiling games that he's been able to access. Running back 5, running back 3 weeks on the season. And as I said, this is the first game that he had finished as the running back 37 or worse than the running back 37. So pretty consistently a floor as a running back, low-end running back 3, but high-end wide running back 1 is the DeAndre Swift range. And I think that this is one of those games where he can hit a ceiling matchup against Chicago. So fire up your DeAndre Swift as a pretty solid running back 2 this week. Running back Jamaal Williams played a season-low 24% of snaps, and he reportedly left this game early with a leg injury. We are going to be monitoring this Jamaal Williams status going into week 17 against Chicago. The last time that he played Chicago, he went 16 for 59. He had a touchdown, finishes the running back 16 with 11.9 fantasy points. Jamaal Williams has not scored a touchdown over the last 3 weeks. We've seen his snap share decrease from 37 to 31 to 24%. Justin Jackson has gotten involved over the last few games. We saw Justin Jackson get 21% of the snaps. So if Jamaal Williams is not good to go, it's going to be more DeAndre Swift. It's going to be Justin Jackson. But in a game that I expect to be a shootout, Jamaal Williams is a running back that if he is active, he's trusted around the goal line. He's trusted with goal line carries. And yeah, he hasn't converted a few of those over the last few games, but still that upside is there. There's a reason why he's the running back 17 on the season, because he's able to convert a lot of those touchdowns, and the variance is going to happen. He's going to fall on the right side or wrong side of variance as we see fit. But Jamaal Williams, this injury has me concerned. So as we're moving forward, I'm not looking to play Jamaal Williams if I can help it. Like I may have mentioned, I'm trusting Tyler Allgeier as a running back too, more confidently than I am Jamaal Williams. I think that's pretty clear moving forward. Another running back, D'Onta Foreman, even against Tampa, who projects to be a tough matchup. Last time D'Onta Foreman played Tampa, 15 for 118, right? And even against a tough Detroit front seven, 21 for 165. So I'm trusting the likes of D'Onta Foreman over Jamaal Williams as well going into this week. Jamaal Williams is a fade for me in week 17 against the Bears, even though on paper it's a plus matchup. We know what we're getting with DJ Chark. He is a matchup dependent wide receiver too. Okay. If he gets a good matchup, he's a back end wide receiver too. If he has a bad matchup, he's virtually a zero. Right. So if we look back to week 12, right, against Buffalo, 2 for 16. He fell in the end zone, but 2 for 16 gets you 2.6 fantasy points. That gets you like wide receiver 75 to 80. Week 13 against Jacksonville, a plus matchup, he goes 5 for 98, no touchdown, wide receiver 23. Week 14 against Minnesota, where I told you to start him, 6 for 94 and a touchdown, wide receiver 6 on the week. Last week against the Jets, I told you to sit DJ Chark, and that panned out well, 1 for 18 on 2 targets. He was the wide receiver 80 on the week. And then week 16, Carolina last week, 4 for 108, big play ability. And that's what I expect. This really beat up secondary for the Chicago Bears. I just expect that Jared Goff, DJ Chark, Amon-Ra St. Brown just feast. And if you want to take some deep shots in DFS on Jameson Williams, on Josh Reynolds, I'm all for that. Yeah, I'm in on DJ Chark week 17 against Chicago. He did not play in the Chicago game earlier in the season. He was dealing with an injury, but DJ Chark is a player that has just tremendous upside. And I think you're like, my ranking is probably going to be as like wide receiver 36 for this week, but he's got low end wide receiver 2 upside. And we've seen even with some massive games, I don't think it's going to be a massive game, but we've seen 3 of the last 4 games for DJ Chark with 94 or more receiving yards. So that is something, a testament to Jared Goff, a testament to the Lions offense. And in a game that could turn into a real shootout, Chicago, DJ Chark is a very interesting flex play for me. I'm finding reasons to put him into a flex spot in my 12 or 14 team league. Talk about consistent. Amon-Ra St. Brown, he's going to get 10 targets. He's going to get his 7 catches. He's going to get his 70 receiving yards. And that's pretty much what he's been each of the last 3 weeks, right? 6 catches, 7 catches, 7 catches, 9, 10, and 13 targets for Amon-Ra St. Brown. He just hasn't fallen in the end zone. Amon-Ra St. Brown has had double-digit fantasy points every week since week 10 against Chicago. So week 10 against Chicago, 17 fantasy points. He went 10 for 119, didn't have a touchdown, 11 targets though, finishes the wide receiver 10. Now imagine he does fall in the end zone, then we're talking about the wide receiver 2, 3, 4 of the week. So Amon-Ra St. Brown, massive upside. The Chicago Bears secondary, they've lost some significant pieces. There's only one player with draft capital that's anticipated to play in the secondary for the Bears for this coming week. So Amon-Ra St. Brown is a must start with high upside. And I wonder what his DFS projected rostership is going to be, but whatever it is, it's probably not going to be high enough. So I'm in on Amon-Ra St. Brown. I want that stack with Jared Goff and probably a comeback around in that Bears game. But nevertheless, this is a shootout game, and Amon-Ra St. Brown is going to be at the center of that. I want in on Amon-Ra St. Brown. Jameson Williams has been a little disappointing lately. I was hoping that this Minnesota game in week 14, where he finishes the wide receiver 30 and had his first NFL catch for a 41-yard touchdown, I thought that was going to be the game where it unlocked a little bit more of the snap share consistently. But no. In week 14, it was 19% of the snaps. Week 15, 19% of the snaps. Week 16, 17% of the snaps. Not the direction that I was hoping it would go for JMO. And this week 17 game, I was hoping would be primed for 50, 60, 70% target snap share. But no, it's not on the cards. And if you've been holding on Jameson Williams for week 17, it just didn't fall that way. The coaching staff has not ramped him up in the way that we want. If you've been holding on to him, unless you're in an extremely deep league, you can let Jameson Williams go. He's not a player that I'm looking to start in week 17. Unfortunately, I was really, really hopeful. And maybe he does. Maybe he makes that leap from 17% snap share to 50 to 60% snaps. I'm not confident in that happening with Amon-Ra St. Brown already there. DJ Chark playing really well. If Raymond played 32% of snaps in this game, Josh Reynolds played 61% of the snaps in this game. So I just don't see Jameson Williams like making that significant tier jump, not just like from 19 or 17% of snaps to 40% of snaps or 60%. Like I just don't see that happening, especially with how we've seen the Detroit Lions limit the snap shares of DeAndre Swift coming off of an injury this season. I'm pessimistic about Jamo Williams. Could he go off? Absolutely. He's uber talented. He can have one big play like he did back against the Minnesota Vikings, but it's not a bet that I'm willing to make. If you want to take a deep shot in DFS on him, I'm totally fine with that. But you also have to realize that he could be the zero that he's been for the majority of his return back from the injured reserve. Shane Zylstra was a play that nobody had. And I mean nobody. 0% rostership on Sleeper, 0% start. If you somehow plugged in Shane Zylstra into your lineup, put a link to screenshots in the comments, please. I want to see your Shane Zylstra receipts, because this is a player who had 6 targets on the season coming into the week 16 game. And he had 6 targets in this game, 5 receptions, 3 touchdowns, only 26 yards. He finishes the tight end 4 on the week, even though he had 3 touchdowns. It's just the kind of week the tight ends had, right? But Shane Zylstra, this was a season high snap share, 44% of snaps. You have to wonder if he's going to be the tight end playing over Brock Wright or Mitchell, James Mitchell, right? James Mitchell played 29% of snaps and Brock Wright played 41% of the snaps. So Zylstra outsnapped the other tight ends in this game. I wonder if that had to do with he caught 1 touchdown, he caught 2 touchdowns. Maybe we'll give him a few more snaps. It's just, this is one of those fluke tight end performances that I'm not like chasing the touchdowns or chasing the usage after, but it's a nice story. Good for Shane Zylstra. I'm happy for him. It's just not going to work out for you for fantasy, at least in a way that I anticipate it's going to be meaningful against Chicago. The stickiness factor is not very strong there, given that he has had 30% or more of the snaps each of the last 4 weeks. But as I said, 6 targets in this week. There were 6 targets the entire season. And if we look back in his game logs back to 2021, we saw one other game in week 14 in 2021 where he had 6 targets when he was playing for the Detroit Lions. We've at least seen one little speck of this previously for Shane Zylstra, but as we know, like, Zylstra is not a household name. It's not a player who you were banking on. 0% rostership. Yes, like if you're a touchdown chaser, like, sure, go for Shane Zylstra, but you're not starting Shane Zylstra over Mark Andrews or even like a Hunter Henry or Greg Dulcich. Like, you're not starting Shane Zylstra. You might have to start him over Dulcich if Dulcich's hamstring injury is going to be limiting him. But even then, I would start Albert Okuegbunam over Shane Zylstra, right? I would just anticipate Okuegbunam would play more snaps. So Zylstra is not a player that I'm in on, and you should not be either. So good for Shane Zylstra, happy for him, but it's not a play that I am targeting moving forward.